The wind howled across the dry fields, kicking up clouds of dust that swirled in the heavy air. The sun barely pierced through the thick, gray clouds, casting a cold and eerie light over the barren landscape. In the middle of this desolate scene, a small German shepherd puppy named Stephen trembled alone. His golden black fur stood on end, his ears flattened against his head in fear. He didn't understand how he had ended up there. All he knew was that his mother was nowhere to be found. His tiny heart pounded violently, and his wide eyes scanned the horizon, searching desperately for anything familiar. But the only thing he found was the ominous sound of wings slicing through the air. First there was one, then another. Within seconds, a dozen crows landed around him, their beady black eyes fixed on the helpless puppy. They didn't caw, they didn't screech. They simply moved in eerie synchronization, their sharp claws scratching against the hardened earth. Stephen took a cautious step backward, but the crows moved forward in unison. Their dark bodies formed a stark contrast against the golden field, making the scene even more unsettling. The puppy let out a high-pitched bark, a desperate plea for help, but the birds remained unfazed. Instead, they closed in, their sleek bodies shifting methodically, as if they were following a sinister plan. Suddenly, one of the crows lunged. Its wings unfurled like a black shadow, and its sharp beak darted towards Stephen with frightening speed. The puppy instinctively ducked, narrowly dodging the attack, but another crow was already diving toward him. They were toying with him, testing him. Their movements weren't random. They were precise, coordinated. Stephen growled, a tiny, trembling sound meant to make himself seem bigger. But the crows? They just kept coming. Then, without warning, a new sound shattered the tense air. A deep, commanding caw. Instantly, the attacking crows froze. Their heads snapped toward the source of the noise, as if receiving an order from an unseen leader. Stephen, still panting, followed their gaze. Perched on a gnarled, lifeless tree was a single, massive crow, larger than any of the others. Its eyes burned with something unsettling: intelligence, calculation. This wasn't an ordinary bird. There was something about it that made even the other crows hesitate. For a moment, everything fell silent. The wind died down. The smaller crows stood still, as if waiting. Stephen could feel the weight of that dark figure's stare pressing down on him. Then, the giant crow slowly spread its wings, releasing another deep, echoing caw. And what happened next was something no one could have ever predicted. The air was thick with tension. Stephen's small body remained frozen, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The giant crow, perched high on the dead tree, kept its piercing gaze locked onto him. The other crows, once aggressive and chaotic, now stood eerily still, their heads tilted slightly as if awaiting further instruction. This wasn't a random attack. There was something deliberate about their behavior, something unnatural. Stephen swallowed hard, his breath shaky as he tried to process what was happening. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, the massive crow lifted off the branch. Its wingspan was enormous, casting a dark shadow over Stephen as it soared toward him. The smaller crows parted instantly, making way for their leader as it landed just a few feet in front of the trembling puppy. Stephen could hear the crunch of dry earth beneath the bird's talons, the unsettling sound of its feathers shifting. The crow took a step closer, then another. It wasn't attacking, it was inspecting him. Stephen let out a small, uncertain growl, his ears twitching as he tried to make sense of the situation. The giant crow responded not with aggression, but with a deep, guttural caw that seemed almost deliberate. It tilted its head, studying Stephen in a way that no ordinary bird should. The smaller crows stirred slightly, as if murmuring among themselves. Something about this moment felt disturbingly intelligent, calculated. Stephen had never encountered a bird behaving this way. Was it warning him, testing him, or was it something far worse? Then, without warning, the giant crow made a sound unlike any other, a low, rhythmic clicking noise deep in its throat. The reaction was immediate. The smaller crows instantly responded, their wings fluttering as they began to move in unison. Stephen's fur bristled as he watched them spread out, forming a rough circle around him. His instincts screamed that this was a trap, but the leader hadn't made a move to hurt him. Not yet. For a brief second, Stephen thought about running. If he sprinted now, maybe he could break through the circle, maybe he could outrun them. But the moment he shifted his weight, the giant crow let out a sharp, commanding call. The other crows reacted instantly, their wings flaring, bodies tensing, ready to block his escape. They had been waiting for this. Stephen's heartbeat thundered in his chest as he realized. They wanted him to stay. They needed him here. But why? Then, as if to answer his unspoken question, the giant crow did something truly shocking. It stepped forward, closer than ever, and then it lowered its head in what could only be described as a bow. The smaller crows followed, dipping their heads slightly, acknowledging the tiny, terrified puppy in their midst. Stephen's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't an attack. This was something far more terrifying. It was a ritual. Stephen's breathing was shallow, his small chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven beats. The giant crow remained bowed before him, its sleek black feathers gleaming under the dim light of the overcast sky. The smaller crows followed its lead, their heads dipped slightly in an eerie display of respect. But why? Why would a flock of crows, creatures known for their cunning and cruelty, act this way toward a lone, frightened puppy? Stephen's instincts told him to run, to flee this unsettling scene, but something held him there. Something in the way they moved, in the way they watched him, suggested there was more to this than just a simple hunt. Then, as if sensing his hesitation, the giant crow lifted its head and cawed. A single, powerful call that sent a chill down Stephen's spine. The other crows responded immediately, their wings rustling as they began shifting into motion again. But this time, they weren't attacking. They were moving away, parting like a black sea, creating an open path leading toward the distant tree line. Stephen's ears perked up, his sharp puppy eyes watching as the enormous crow took a step back and turned its body slightly toward the opening, as if inviting him to follow. Stephen hesitated. Was this a trick? A new kind of trap? He had no reason to trust these birds, yet something about their behavior didn't feel like mere animal instinct. They weren't just luring him in, they were waiting for him to decide. A strange tension hung in the air, as if the entire world had paused for his next move. The giant crow didn't push him, simply watched, expectant, patient. Stephen had never felt so small, yet so important. His paws shuffled uncertainly on the dry earth. What choice did he really have? Running wasn't an option. He had seen how fast the crows could move, how they could surround him in an instant. If they had wanted him dead, they would have already done it. And so, against every instinct screaming inside him, Stephen took a cautious step forward. The moment his paw touched the path they had created, the crows let out a collective, approving rustle, soft, almost like whispers of wind through dry leaves. The giant crow turned and walked ahead, leading the way. Stephen followed. Each step felt heavier than the last, like he was crossing an invisible threshold into something unknown, something ancient. The open field behind him felt miles away now, and the towering trees ahead seemed darker than before. The other crows moved with him, flanking his sides but never touching him, never forcing him. They were escorting him. As the shadows of the forest swallowed them whole, Stephen couldn't shake the feeling that whatever awaited him in those woods wasn't just fate. It was something that had been waiting for him all along. The moment Stephen crossed into the tree line, the world seemed to change. The air was colder, thicker, as if the very atmosphere carried a secret too heavy to be spoken. The towering trees stretched endlessly above him, their skeletal branches twisting like fingers reaching for something unseen. The crows moved silently now, their wings barely making a sound as they guided him deeper into the forest. The further he walked, the more the outside world faded. It was as if the open field, the sky, and everything familiar had been swallowed whole. Stephen's small paws pressed against the damp earth, his ears twitching at the eerie silence. No birds chirped, no leaves rustled, Even the wind had abandoned this place. He turned his head slightly, glancing at the crows around him. They were watching him, not with hunger, not with malice, but with something far stranger. Expectation. His heart pounded harder. He didn't belong here, and yet he was being led as if he did. Then the giant crow ahead of him stopped. It stood motionless, its dark silhouette blending into the twisted trees. The other crows followed suit, perching on low-hanging branches, their glossy feathers shimmering even in the dim light. Stephen swallowed, feeling a strange, invisible pressure settle over him. Something was about to happen. He could feel it in his bones. The enormous crow slowly turned to face him. Then, without warning, it let out a deep, guttural caw, louder than before, filled with something ancient, something commanding. The sound rippled through the air like a force, sending a shiver down Stephen's spine. In response, the other crows flared their wings, tilting their heads upward in unison. It was as if they were answering a call. A ritual had begun. Stephen's breath quickened. The forest seemed to tighten around him, like a living thing watching, waiting. The giant crow took a step closer, lowering its head slightly, its dark eyes locked onto his. And then, it spoke. Not in words, not in any language Stephen understood, but in a series of low clicks and caws, layered and complex. Somewhere deep inside him, an unsettling realization took root. This wasn't random noise. It was speech. The crows weren't just guiding him. They were preparing him. But for what? He wasn't sure he wanted to know. Stephen's paws felt heavier with every step, as if the very ground beneath him was trying to hold him in place. The massive crow stood before him, its dark eyes reflecting something far beyond simple animal instinct. Around them, the other crows remained eerily still, perched on twisted branches, their beady eyes locked onto him. There was no escape now, only the weight of whatever was about to happen. Then the giant crow spread its wings, not as a threat but as a declaration. It let out another deep, guttural caw, and the air around Stephen seemed to shift, charged with an invisible energy he couldn't explain. The other crows responded immediately, their voices rising in eerie unison. It wasn't just noise, it was a chant, a rhythm, something ancient, something alive. Stephen's ears flattened against his head as the sound surrounded him, seeping into his very bones. His small body trembled, but not from fear alone. Something was happening, something he didn't understand but could feel deep inside him. It was as if the sound itself was unlocking something buried within him, something he had never known was there. His vision blurred for a moment, and a strange warmth spread through his chest. Then the giant crow stepped closer. It lowered its head again, almost as if bowing to him, and then it touched him. The bird's beak gently pressed against Stephen's forehead, and the moment it did, a shockwave of sensation tore through him. A flood of images, memories that weren't his, rushed into his mind. A vast sky filled with circling black wings, a towering tree older than time itself, and a feeling powerful, undeniable, that he was part of something far greater than he had ever imagined. Stephen gasped, stumbling backward, his breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. The crows didn't move, didn't react. They simply watched, waiting. He looked up at the giant crow, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. The bird had given him something, a truth, a connection. But to what? And then, as if hearing his unspoken question, the giant crow cawed once more. This time, Stephen understood. Not in words, but in meaning. He wasn't just some lost puppy. He had been chosen, and whatever came next, he would never be the same again. A strange silence fell over the forest. The ritual was over, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air, pressing against Stephen's small body like an invisible force. His heart pounded as he tried to make sense of the flood of images that had invaded his mind. The endless sky, the ancient tree, the sensation of something far greater than himself reaching out to him. He felt different, as if a part of him had been unlocked, a part he had never known existed. The giant crow stepped back, its piercing gaze never leaving Stephen. The smaller crows remained still, their beady eyes reflecting something deeper than instinct. Stephen could feel it now, a connection, a presence, something binding him to them in a way that defied explanation. He wasn't just a lost puppy anymore. He was part of something older than time itself. Then, as if sensing his thoughts, the giant crow cawed. A deep, resonant sound that sent a shiver down Stephen's spine. The other crows responded instantly, their wings fluttering in perfect harmony. It was no longer a chant. It was a command. And in that moment, Stephen understood. They weren't just watching him. They were waiting for him to act. Stephen took a shaky step forward. For the first time, he wasn't just following them, he was moving with them. The crows parted, allowing him to walk through, their sharp eyes filled with something that almost resembled approval. The forest no longer felt foreign or threatening. Felt familiar, like home. The wind picked up again, rustling through the trees, and Stephen turned his head toward the sky. For the first time, he didn't feel small or helpless. He felt powerful. He felt chosen. The giant crow spread its wings wide, letting out one final, commanding cry. It was time. And as Stephen stepped forward, deeper into the unknown, he knew he would never be the same again. Stephen walked deeper into the forest, his paws pressing into the cool, damp earth. The crows moved with him, not ahead, not behind, beside him. Their presence no longer felt threatening. Felt, right? The eerie silence of the woods had shifted, no longer heavy with fear, but instead filled with an unspoken understanding. Something inside him had changed, and he wasn't sure if he would ever be the same again. The giant crow led the way, its dark feathers blending into the shadows of the trees. Stephen didn't question where they were going. He already knew. The images burned into his mind during the ritual weren't just visions. They were a map, a calling. And at the center of it all stood the towering tree he had seen in his mind, the place where everything would finally make sense. As they walked, Stephen became aware of something new. He could hear them, not just their caws, not just the rustling of their wings, but their thoughts. It wasn't words exactly, but emotions, sensations, fragments of understanding that flowed through him like a river. The crows weren't just following instincts. They had a purpose, and now, somehow, he was a part of it. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, and Stephen stopped. In the distance, barely visible through the thick fog rolling over the ground, he could see it. The ancient tree from his vision stood tall, its gnarled roots twisting like veins through the earth. It looked impossibly old, its branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal arms. This was where he was meant to be. The giant crow turned to face him, its dark eyes filled with something unreadable. It was waiting for him to take the final step, to accept whatever fate had been placed before him. The other crows gathered in a wide circle, their black feathers rippling in the wind, silent and expectant. Stephen's heart pounded. He knew that once he crossed that final threshold, there would be no turning back. Taking a deep breath, Stephen stepped forward. And as he did, the sky above him darkened, the wind howled through the trees, and the truth of who he was, what he was meant to become, began to reveal itself. As Stephen stepped closer to the ancient tree, an unexplainable force pulsed beneath his paws, vibrating through the ground like the distant echo of a heartbeat. The tree was massive, its thick, gnarled roots weaving through the earth like the veins of something ancient and alive. Deep grooves and carvings covered its bark, forming intricate patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if left behind by something or someone long ago. The air was thick, charged with an unseen energy that sent a shiver down Stephen's spine. Though he had never been here before, he felt an unsettling sense of familiarity, as if a part of him had always known this place existed. The crows surrounded him, their black feathers blending into the deepening shadows of the forest. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. High above, the giant crow, the leader of the flock, descended from its perch. Its massive wings barely made a sound as it landed gracefully on a low branch, talons gripping the ancient wood. Stephen stared at the bird, his heart pounding in his chest. There was intelligence in its dark eyes, something far beyond mere instinct. It let out a slow, guttural caw, low, deliberate, and commanding. The other crows immediately reacted, spreading their wings and tightening their formation, their bodies now forming a perfect, unbroken circle around Stephen and the tree. The puppy swallowed hard, his ears twitching at the strange, synchronized movement. He wasn't just being guided anymore. He was being inducted. Then, without hesitation, the giant crow turned and pressed its beak against the bark of the tree. The moment it did, a deep, resonant vibration filled the air. Not from the crows, not from the wind, but from the tree itself. The forest, once eerily silent, now hummed with an ancient energy. Stephen's eyes widened as the carved patterns in the bark began to glow, dimly at first, like embers awakening in a long-dead fire. But within seconds, the light intensified, crawling through the grooves like golden veins pulsing with life. The ground beneath him felt warmer, almost as if the very earth recognized his presence. And then, just like before, the visions came. Stephen's mind exploded with images. Shadows of crows stretching across endless skies, their black wings merging with storm clouds. A great tree, not just in this moment but in different times, different ages, standing as an eternal witness to something far beyond human comprehension. And then, something else. A presence, something unseen but impossibly vast, watching through the eyes of the crows, whispering through their calls, guiding them across generations. Stephen gasped, his small body trembling under the weight of it all. The crows weren't just birds. They were messengers, guardians of a power as old as the earth itself. And now, for reasons he could not yet understand, that power was reaching out to him. The giant crow turned to him again, its gaze heavy with unspoken meaning. This was the final moment, the ultimate choice. Whatever had been set into motion could not be undone. Stephen could feel it now, a silent invitation echoing in his mind, urging him to take the last step. The crows did not force him. They simply waited. He could turn away, return to the life of an ordinary dog, forever haunted by the knowledge that something greater had once called to him. Or he could step forward and accept the truth, the destiny that had been waiting for him all along. Swallowing hard, Stephen lifted his paw and pressed it against the glowing bark of the ancient tree. The moment his fur touched the surface, a rush of warmth surged through his body, burning like fire but carrying no pain. The light from the tree flared brighter, casting golden rays through the twisted branches. The crows let out a synchronized cry, their voices rising in an eerie, melodic chant that sent chills through Stephen's body. The ancient power that had remained dormant for centuries was waking up, and he was now a part of it. As the final echoes of the crow's chant faded into the silent forest, Stephen knew with absolute certainty that he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. He was no longer just a lost puppy. He had been chosen, and whatever that meant, whatever purpose the crows had for him, was about to be revealed. The moment Stephen's paw touched the ancient tree, a pulse of energy exploded outward, rippling through the ground like an unseen wave. The golden veins in the bark flared brilliantly, illuminating the entire forest in an eerie, flickering glow. The air became thick with something indescribable, an ancient presence, a force older than the trees, older than the sky itself. The crows remained silent, unmoving, their black eyes fixed on him as if waiting for something monumental to occur. And then it did. Stephen's mind was pulled into something vast, something beyond himself. He was no longer just standing in the forest, he was everywhere, seeing through 1,000 different eyes at once. His heartbeat slowed as visions rushed into his consciousness. He saw lands untouched by time, places where the crows had gathered for centuries, always watching, always waiting. He saw storms forming over distant mountains, great rivers carving their paths through the earth. He saw civilizations rise and fall, their stories carried away on the wings of black-feathered watchers. The crows weren't just birds. They were keepers of a memory, guardians of a knowledge that had long been forgotten by the world. And now Stephen was part of it. His small body trembled as the reality of what had happened settled in. He wasn't just an outsider anymore. He had been accepted. The ritual hadn't just chosen him, it had changed him. He could feel it coursing through him, something new, something powerful. He was no longer just a lost puppy. He was connected to the crows, bound to their purpose in a way he had yet to fully understand. But the knowledge was there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be unlocked. The giant crow, the leader, stepped forward. It lowered its head, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. Stephen had passed the test. He had proven himself worthy. The other crows followed, dipping their heads in eerie unison. The air buzzed with an unspoken understanding. This wasn't just acceptance. It was an initiation. Stephen took a deep breath, his paws sinking into the soft earth. He felt the weight of something bigger than himself pressing down on his small body. Yet, for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He knew now this had always been his path. The visions, the whispers in the wind, the feeling of belonging. He hadn't been brought here by chance. He had been called. And as the last of the golden light faded from the tree, Stephen understood what he had become. He wasn't just part of the crows. He was one of them. Chapter 10: The Legacy of the Crows. Stephen stood before the ancient tree, his small body still trembling from the surge of energy that had passed through him. The glow in the bark had faded, but the change within him remained. He could feel it in his heartbeat, in the way the wind moved differently against his fur, in the way the crows no longer looked at him as an outsider. He was part of them now, not just in presence, but in something deeper, something unspoken, something eternal. The giant crow, the leader of the flock, took a step closer. Its dark eyes held a depth Stephen had never noticed before. This was no ordinary bird. It had seen lifetimes, carried knowledge beyond words. And now Stephen was bound to that knowledge as well. The giant crow let out a single, powerful caw, a final command, a final acknowledgement. Stephen understood without needing an explanation. His old life was over. Whatever he had been before this moment no longer mattered. The other crows shifted, opening a path for him. They were no longer surrounding him. They were welcoming him forward. He wasn't their captive. He was their kin. The forest, once eerie and unknown, now felt like home. The sky above, once vast and unreachable, now felt like an open door. Stephen felt something awaken in his chest. A need to move, to fly, to follow them into whatever came next. He turned his head one last time, glancing back at the direction he had come from. The fields beyond the trees, the life he had once known. It all felt so distant now. The scared, lost puppy who had wandered into this place no longer existed. Something new had taken his place. Something stronger. Something more. The wind stirred again, and the giant crow spread its massive wings. Without hesitation, the others followed, taking to the sky in a synchronized storm of black feathers. Stephen felt the pull inside him, the unshakable instinct that told him to follow. He didn't resist. He embraced it. As his paws left the ground, carried by something unseen, something greater than himself, Stephen understood the truth. He had not been lost. He had been found. And from this moment forward, his destiny would forever be written in the sky.